Welcome back to Kelma B'Kelma. This is episode 10. So thank you to everyone who've watched our previous 9 episodes. We're very lucky to make it to double figures within the same year that we started doing this series. My name is Balakrishnan. I'm the country presenter for Yes Europe Malta. Today we are in Żgħażagħ Ħaddiema Nsara's offices in Floriana, and we're joined by Natalia Mangion, who is a newly joined member of ZHN. Natalia is a master's degree student in economics at the University of Malta and is very passionate about economic issues, including well-being and environmental economics. She believes in advocating for an economy that looks beyond GDP, which led to her work on the Wellbeing INDEX project as a research support assistant at the University's Department of Economics. You can read all about that project down below. Her work with ZHN centers around the strive to improve the working conditions for all workers by advocating for strong rights and unions and understanding legal frameworks. So this is going to be a conversation about how sustainable the labour market is currently in Malta. To provide a bit of context, the budget for 2024 was announced yesterday. So maybe we might talk about a little bit about that as well, even though this interview was planned well beyond the budget announcements that were announced. But ultimately it will be a conversation about sort of labour in Malta and workers' rights and the importance of unions. So Natalia, thank you for joining us today and thank you for letting us into your centre.
Thanks to you for the invitation.
Perfect. So we are living in uncertain financial times where all levels of society may have to compromise in adopting sustainable decisions in order to safeguard their finances. Do you think there is a sustainable economic model that can be implemented to ensure that society can continue making profits without significant compromise on sustainable values?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. As you said, I mean, currently the times we are living in are very extraordinary, and even in the context of higher levels of inflation than would normally be the case, reaching the same levels of profits might be difficult. But I think it's good to distinguish between profits which sort of businesses make that are there to act as a buffer, so profits which are there so that if in times like these you have something to sort of safeguard which keeps your business model sustainable, and exorbitant prices which are at the end of the day which would push up the inflation rate and so on. In fact, I think at first sort of glance the word profits and the word sustainability might seem a bit contradictory, you know? I mean, it doesn't mean that making profits is necessarily or inherently a bad thing. I think profits are very important for society and for the workers who are generating them as well. But it's also about having the sort of right culture in place, where we're not really talking about, for example, planned obsolescence, you know, I mean, that doesn't really lend itself to a sustainable model. So if you have a culture where you're constantly bombarded and encouraged to buy more, where we have fast fashion, as I was saying, planned obsolescence, that might obviously limit the extent of sustainability which is possible. In terms of an economic model, we often speak about circular economies,
Absolutely.
Which are very interesting because we aim with a circular economy to put the materials and the resources that we are using back into the system. So we don't sort of waste them, but we are putting them back in. However, of course, there are some barriers to circular economies, and they're not as mainstream. They're not very easy to implement, I would say. But there are certain reports which show circularity, like the Circularity Gap Report, for instance. Recently there is also, for example, the post-growth movement, which looks at degrowth, for example, but that is, again, it's still gaining traction, where basically the aim of the economy would not be just economic growth, but where you focus on actually reducing your consumption to be in line with planetary boundaries.
Sure, and we've talked about sustainable economy quite frequently in the series. Systems thinking was something that we touched upon in episode 1 with Dr. Paul Refalo, and in episode 8 with Gabriel Muscat, we talked about sort of proactive decision making when it comes to making sustainable decisions. So do you think all of these kind of like mindsets are quite important when you're sort of in government or you're a policymaker when trying to formulate a sustainable economy, which is to contextualize it in the form of all of the inputs that need to go into it when you want to come up with a strategy that works?
Exactly. So I think something that is really important here is the incentive. So of course people have different incentives, and the role of the policymaker would be to provide the right incentive. So if it pays, for example, if a businessman it pays them more, there is the incentive to not be sustainable, then it doesn't pay them to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, it's the role of the policymaker, which is of course not an easy task, to find the right incentives, because even individuals are myopic, so we tend to think in the short term. So we do not tend to think of our consequences in the longer term. And that is a very important point, because if everyone is only considering the short term, you need to have the policymaker who has a longer term vision to sort of put everyone on track with the collective in mind, because as individuals we focus on our actions. And even in our actions, we focus on how they affect us, not how they affect others as a whole. In fact, in economics, we talk a lot about these externalities, and these externalities are hard to measure, and they are not really considered in this sort of decision-making process which both consumers and business people take. And that is where you have to provide, of course, the right incentive.
Sure. Okay, let's have a chat about sort of statistical analyses and metrics to use to kind of measure sustainable economy. Could you explain what the Happy Planet Index is, and can prioritizing inclusivity in our society lead to an increase in a country's Happy Planet Index?
Yeah, okay, so the Happy Planet Index is a very interesting index, because even though it measures the well-being of a country, it also factors in the ecological footprint, you know? So it doesn't just take how satisfied people are with their lives and measures how well they are generating well-being, but it also looks at the efficiency with which they are generating well-being. For example, if you look at the World Happiness Report, you would see that Finland and Nordic countries, they rank very highly on well-being. They are some of the happiest countries, and we've often heard that Finland is the happiest country. But over there, we're not really factoring in the ecological footprint in terms of generating that well-being. On the other hand, the Happy Planet Index looks at the ecological footprint which it costs to generate those levels.
So it's not just high social welfare, it's
Exactly.
what it's taking to generate that high
Exactly.
social
In
welfare.
fact, Costa Rica tends to score as first on the Happy Planet Index. In fact, the sort of motto of this index is that good lives do not have to cost the earth.
Okay. And do you think it's important just for government to be aware? Because obviously they are the ones who are implementing policies that affect our day-to-day lives, so things like, incentives, social benefits, tax rates, etc. They're the ones who are implementing that strategic plan. Do you think it's just important for people in government to be aware about a Happy Planet Index, or all levels of society to be involved in that sort of level of engagement?
I think it could be beneficial not just for sort of government levels to be aware of this, because this data is something that is already published, it's publicly available, and it really helps to track the ecological footprint and movements in well-being.
Okay.
For example, for Malta, we have to see the statistics. We tend to score quite highly. We're in the green zone for life, because it takes life expectancy multiplied by the well-being, and then it discounts by the ecological footprint. So we tend to do okay on the well-being part and on the longevity part, but less well on the sustainability part. So that could be a sort of indicator where you can improve. And I link this to your second part of the question, because you asked me whether inclusivity would improve. And although I think that question is important, I also think that the reverse question is important. So not just whether inclusivity would improve our rating on the Happy Planet Index, but whether the Happy Planet Index, if we do have an improvement in inclusivity, whether it would be reflected. Because I think it's an important point to understand why we collect statistics. We do not collect statistics just for the sake of having a high rating. But the statistics are there to guide us, they are indicators, that's why they are called indicators, because they are there to give us direction, to show us where we stand and where we want to go. So it's very important that we do not sort of select an index or an indicator which will just sort of make us look better, but which is reflective of our true conditions and which gives us this direction on where we want to go in the future as well.
Perfect. And on the topic of statistics, let's talk about some more statistics. Malta has a relatively high employment rate, with youth unemployment being less than 10% as of June 2023. Sections of some labour-based sectors, though diverse in this country, have been coming under fire for workers' conditions in the face of inflation and a rising cost of living. And it's important to contextualise this as well for the salary increase and the increase in minimum wages that were announced yesterday. So do you think it is taken for granted how crucial a set of healthy workers' rights standards are in our democratic society?
Yeah, so I think that workers' rights are, first of all, very important because at ZHN we really believe in this, and it's part of our scope basically, where we think that we should prioritize workers' rights because every person has their own dignity. But also workers' rights are something that will impact a person's well-being. So if you're going to take, for example, two hypothetical persons where someone has very high level of workers' rights and the other one does not, everything else being equal, you would presume that the one which has more rights is obviously doing better in their life.
Yes.
Especially with working hours, where the working day takes up a significant portion of someone's time. I mean, in fact, there was a recent study which calculated the cost in terms of well-being of commuting time, and they found that annually it would come up to around 40k. For someone who earns around 60k. Obviously this wasn't done in Malta.
Yeah.
But I mean, even in terms of workers' rights, it's not just about the quantity of jobs that there are, but even in terms of their quality.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's why we're speaking of workers' conditions. There is also the point on workers' conditions that we need to educate about workers' conditions. So at ZHN we try to also fill in the gaps in the education system by keeping, first of all, ourselves informed and also educate others about workers' rights, because sometimes the thing is that not everyone is aware of what their rights are, and you cannot really have people who are pushing to get their rights sort of respected if they don't even know what these rights entail. So that is a very important point. Another very important point is the role of skills mismatches. So there was a recent survey in Malta, the Malta Skills Survey, and basically this found that 54% of workers, so we're saying that more than half of workers are either overqualified or underqualified. And that of course lends itself to problems in the labour market, where you have people who are underqualified and could be doing better jobs, whereas there are others who are overqualified. For example, they have a degree, for example, but they're in a job which does not require a degree, for instance.
Sure.
And these skills mismatches are also something that are worth working on.
I think it's quite a complicated situation, right? So Malta is, I don't know whether we're classified as a developing country still, but there's various sectors which are still developing. So obviously construction is quite rife. You can attribute that to obviously a huge population. A lot of markets and a lot of sectors are quite saturated. There's a lot of projects that are always ongoing, with regards to kind of infrastructure, the widening of roads, more bike lanes, a lot of greening projects that are taking place. Obviously pollution tends to affect that. So if something was not designed with a clear vision in mind or designed in an improper way, you then have to kind of repair the mistake that was made, and then that's more infrastructure that has to be developed. And obviously that needs hands on deck, right? So you look at how sort of complicated that scenario is, but then you also look at how competitive a lot of jobs are as well, and jobs which require a lot of skill. I'm unsure of the details of it, but I think there's a scheme that's been introduced now where the skill of third country nationals might have to be assessed before they start getting some jobs. So it's good to see that there's some proactive kind of measures being implemented from a policy point of view to, I guess, tackle the state of employment, and then obviously the workers' conditions can kind of barrel roll from there. So, what's kind of your take on the current landscape on what's happening in Malta in terms of opportunities for people, and then obviously the benefits that they may get out of that?
I mean, I think that you really have to sort of match the population of the country. You have to sort of see the employment levels in that perspective. So of course, we have a very high percentage of the labor force who are in employment, and the unemployment rate is very low. And in fact, we are of course importing workers. But I mean, if we're not just seeing the labor market, but we're seeing it at an economy-wide level, I think it's good to also see at what cost that is coming in terms of quality of life, in terms of overpopulation and population density, and in terms even of the quality of life of the workers themselves whom we are getting here to Malta, and how long they are actually staying here as well.
Okay, quality of life, you brought it up, so let's have a chat about quality of life. Should an assurance of quality of life be a priority for any young person who's entering the labour market?
Yeah, so in reality, I think that quality of life should be a priority for everyone, not just young workers, but of course I do see the question. As well, I think another important point is that many young people today face the choice between either living in Malta or else obviously going abroad elsewhere, And I think quality of life plays a key role here in determining whether they choose to stay or not, because of course there is a lot of investment. For example, let's say you have a lot of young people who are getting, for example, a degree, who spend a number of years studying in Malta but then get a better job abroad. For example, there are better opportunities in that sector. But there are also issues related to quality of life. So for example, as we were saying, some things we've been discussing like construction, lots of congestion and traffic, These are all factors which will be directly impacting the working life of young workers.
I think it depends how you want to look at quality of life, because it can be quite subjective, and you're meeting the needs of what young people want. And as you said, everybody deserves a quality life. But again, incentives probably play into that. So, once you sort of graduate and you're working, you want to save up to, buy a house or buy a flat. You have incentives for first-time buyers going into the property market, so that can help ensure a better quality life for people who want to live in Malta, young people who want to live in Malta. Social welfare that's there, any benefits that they can benefit from I guess the tax money that they pay. But then if you look at it, that there's always going to be a competition for jobs that Maltese people could get in Malta compared to abroad. I think it's quite good that we have a very healthy education sector. There's a number of kind of opportunities available for people to study. But that's always going to be the kind of aspect of it with regards to employment. I think jobs will always be available. Employment in Malta is relatively low. But I think quality is always going to be subjective, right? I think it just depends from sector to sector.
And as well, another point is that at ZHN we also focus on meaningful work, where workers can feel like they have a purpose on their job and that what they're doing is actually contributing to society,
Perfect. Okay, so let's have a chat about another sustainable economic model, which is the donut economic model. It is a concept which hasn't fully penetrated Maltese sustainable economic discourse, at least not within the general public. I think a lot of people are very well aware about circular economy, but the donut economic model is just an elaboration on that, with a consideration for the environment as well, which Natalia will elaborate. It is a theory which many sections of Yes Europe have created discourse about. It's something we talked about quite extensively at the annual conference in Athens in April of this year. So could you describe what donut economics is and how it could be applicable to a Maltese economic model?
Yeah, so basically the donut model it's a very good tool because first of all, it sort of visually, it changes the usual sort of narrative that we're used to seeing in economics, with your basic demand and supply curves, and instead it shows you two concentric circles, and hence obviously the name why it's called donut economics. Basically, the inner circle is the social foundation, while the outer circle is more of a planetary boundaries perspective. So the way it works is that it tells us that no one should be below the inner circle, so basically that there is enough for everyone, but not too much, where people are consuming too much, that they exceed the planetary boundaries. In fact, on a more sort of global scale, a recent report was published on this, and in fact 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries are being overshot, because we are of course consuming more than the planet can sustain. And that is already an indicator in itself. Previously we were speaking about indicators giving us direction. This is a very important indication of overconsumption, basically. And it's also a very interesting model because it is very similar to other models which currently are used to measure well-being, which are there to complement GDP as a measure of progress, where you're focusing on inclusion and sustainability. In fact, most frameworks are following this sort of WISE framework: well-being, inclusion and sustainability, where you're measuring well-being today, well-being for everyone, and well-being tomorrow as well.
Okay.
So I think that's a very nice way to sort of think about it, because we're including not just, we are sort of elaborating on GDP, which is measuring the monetary aspect. We're also measuring well-being, and we are including in this well-being measure the main critiques which are leveled at GDP, namely that it ignores the distribution and that it does not look at sustainability concerns. So of course, if we're introducing a well-being measure to complement GDP, it must overcome these shortcomings which the GDP measure itself has. Although, of course, I'm not saying that the GDP as a statistic is a useless statistic. It has its important uses, but we need to use it as it was intended to, even considering the way it came about.
So based on your opinion about sort of that economic outlook, do you think it's being implemented to guide policy in Malta in terms of the donor economics?
There has been some discourse around that. So, for example, the Malta Chamber mentioned it could be a model that is applied for Malta. And in fact, when you unroll this donut, there are 4 lenses. There is the local and the global lens, but also the social and the ecological. So there are different lenses at which you can apply it. I mean, abroad it's been applied to business models and even at a regional level. So it's in other countries which are bigger in size, sometimes it's implemented at a regional level, but Malta as a country could be a regional level in another country, you know. So I do believe that it could be implemented, but we need to create, first of all, more awareness about the model, more participation, because creating a participatory environment is very important, and of course make sure that we have reliable data which is capturing what we really wanted to capture.
Terrific, perfect. So we like to end every Kelma B'Kelma interview with contextualizing the topics that we talked about, but in the context of younger generations. That's who we are at Yes Europe. We're an NGO for young people, and so is Religion. So do you think that the Maltese population, the young Maltese population, see a focus on environmentalism as relevant to their daily lives, especially in the face of some cynicism that's felt by the youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that environmentalism is a very important point nowadays, and you know, even if you see young people's willingness to pay for more sustainable goods, I think that is there as well, especially when you consider that most young people do not have as high an income. The fact that they are willing to pay for things which cost more because they are more sustainable is already indicative. There is also a lot of participation in NGOs, in environmental NGOs, and a lot of activism. Although, of course, I mean, as we were saying, there is this decision whether you should sort of, as a young person, remain in Malta or look beyond the island to sort of find a better environment.
So do you think it's sustainable for young people to continue making individual sustainable decisions without sort of policy helping people? Or do you think that obviously we are in a situation where you know, we are going to inherit the world that's being left for us, and we want to leave it in a better place for those who inherit from us, but that's not the trajectory that's going on. So sustainability has to be the push for that, but I guess it has to be a collective effort and it needs to be all generations. While we're on this planet, it has to be an all generational push. So as much as young people are kind of, I guess, the ones in the back of the queue for this planet, they're the ones in the front of the queue who are actually pushing it forward. So do you think it's just young people who have to be involved in that? Do you think engagement has to take place for all kind of generations?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because if individuals are individually doing something which is sustainable without policymakers, then the end result is a collective, But the reality is that you will have some individuals who are doing something sustainable, even if it is at a disincentive.
Yeah.
But it will not be all people. So if everyone had to act on their own initiative and act sustainably, then that would be the ideal case. But then that is where policy can nudge people into acting more sustainably and achieving this collective effort. Although, on your last point, it's very important that, as you were saying, it's not just the younger generation, although the younger generation has a role in sort of giving an example and even providing a certain level of hope.
Perfect. That's a terrific place for us to end our interview. So thank you, Natalia, and to Cilia for sort of having us here at your office this evening. And thank you to everyone for watching episode 10 of our Kelma B'Kelma series.